Sub-zero temperatures, icy winds, and yards of snow without heating, warm winter clothing, or supermarkets, unimaginable for us today. But for the Germanic tribes, this was their reality every year, and yet they survived. They developed ingenious solutions that we still use today in some cases. Their greatest ally, their own homes. But these were not cozy huts with open fires and cozy furs, but rather functional survival machines. Most Germanic tribes lived in longhouses up to 100 feet long, 16 to 26 feet wide, and built of wood, clay, and wattle. There were no windows. If there were any, they were tiny and often covered with animal skins or leather to keep the wind out. The roof was made of straw or reeds, which kept out the rain but did not provide perfect insulation against the cold. Modern thermal insulation was something they could only dream of, but the biggest problem was not only the cold outside, but also the way people had to keep warm. In the middle of the house, an open fire burned almost around the clock, a hearth that was not only used for cooking, but was also the only source of heat. But there was a problem. Chimneys did not exist. The smoke simply escaped through the roof or accumulated in the room. This meant a permanent wall of smoke that burned the eyes, irritated the lungs, and ensured that every inhabitant literally lived in smoke. But as unpleasant as this was, it had one decisive advantage. The smoke kept vermin away, preserved meat through smoking, and even had a kind of medicinal effect. Modern studies show that light smoke exposure can strengthen the immune system. The Germanic tribes may have smelled like a permanent campfire, but it helped them survive the winter. However, the most important trick was something that may sound absurd today. They shared their homes with their animals: cows, pigs, goats, and chickens. In winter, they were brought into the house, not only for practical reasons, but as living heaters. A cow gives off about as much heat as a small electric heater. A pig at least as much as a medium-sized fan heater. The heat from the animals raised the indoor temperature by several degrees Fahrenheit, a difference that was vital for survival. The downside: stench, noise, and chaos. But when the alternative was freezing to death in the icy cold, the choice was clear. Of course, each tribe had its own techniques for dealing with the cold. The Saxons in the north, who often had to contend with icy coastal winds, built their houses with additional earth walls as windbreaks and used peat as roofing material because it provided excellent insulation. The Alemanni in the south employed a different tactic. They dug their houses halfway into the ground. These so-called pit houses used the natural heat of the ground as insulation. The Frisians, who lived on the North Sea coast, not only had to protect themselves against the cold, but also against flooding. Their houses stood on artificially raised mounds of earth, which protected them from flooding. They used moss and dried grass to insulate their walls. The Thuringians and Bavarians in what is now central and southern Germany relied on solid wooden beam houses with clay joints, one of the best methods for storing heat and keeping the cold out. But even with these tricks, winter was a challenge. The Germanic tribes developed clever methods to keep warm at night. They slept on raised platforms because warm air rises. They used hot stones from the fireplace, which they wrapped in cloths and took to bed with them, essentially the first hot water bottle in history. Layers of straw provided additional insulation against the icy cold of the floor. And most importantly, they slept close together. Body heat was essential for survival back then, so it was completely normal for family members to snuggle up close to each other. A house was good, but what if you had to go outside to fetch firewood, tend to animals, or hunt? No one could stay in the longhouse all winter, and outside awaited the cold, snowstorms, icy winds, and damp wetness. Those who did not dress properly were doomed to die. The Germanic tribes had no modern fabrics, no thermal underwear, no waterproof boots, but they had knowledge. The most important principle: layers, layer upon layer. They wore linen directly on their skin, a thin barrier against the scratchy wool. Over that, they wore a woolen tunic, densely woven, warm and sturdy. And on top of that, a heavy coat made of wool or animal fur. Those who could wore fur, wolf, fox, bear, or sheep. Fur on the inside meant maximum warmth. Fur on the outside meant better protection against wind and rain. But warm clothing alone was not enough. Wet feet meant certain death. Germanic leather shoes, often made from cowhide or goatskin, were stuffed with wool, dry moss, or straw. In addition, there were leg wraps made of wool or linen, a kind of early thermal socks that provided insulation even when damp. And then there was the problem of moisture. Anyone who has ever been out in winter with soaked clothing knows how merciless the cold can be. The Saxons and Frisians had an ingenious solution. They rubbed their clothes with animal fat, usually lard or fish oil, a primitive but effective impregnation that was water-repellent, windproof, and heat-retaining. All men and Bavarians who had to contend with alpine cold wore thicker wool coats, often with hoods to keep out the icy mountain wind. The Thuringians and Chatti preferred extra thick woolen trousers, indispensable when you had to fight your way through waist-high snow. But clothing was not only protection, it was also a status symbol. The wealthier wore fabrics dyed with plant dyes. Red or blue were expensive, brown and grey were commonplace. Furs stood for power. This man was either a feared hunter or rich enough to afford it. But whether rich or poor, clothing was a matter of life and death. Every piece of fabric, every fur, every layer was carefully thought out, because in the icy wilderness of Germania, it was not the strongest who survived, but the smartest. A warm house and thick clothing were essential for survival, but none of that helped if your stomach remained empty. Winter knew no mercy, no fresh fruit, no harvest, hardly any hunting, and certainly no supermarkets. Those who had not made provisions in summer had to go hungry in winter, and those who went hungry in winter often did not survive until spring. The Germanic tribes were no longer purely hunters and gatherers, but they were not yet highly developed farmers either. They lived in a world where agriculture, livestock breeding, and hunting coexisted, without modern technology, without fertilizers, and without a plan B in case the harvest failed. The most important rule was work in the summer to survive in the winter. Those who did not prepare had a serious problem in the icy January. Cereals were the basis of the Germanic diet, not wheat as in the Roman areas, but barley, oats, spelt, and rye. Flour was stored in clay or wooden containers to prevent it from becoming damp. It was used to make porridge, lots of porridge, thick and filling, often refined with honey or dried berries. Flatbread was also baked on hot stones, sometimes enriched with seeds or nuts. And then there was beer. Yes, the Germanic tribes drank beer, and regularly, but not as we know it today. Their beer was thick, hardly alcoholic, and more like a kind of liquid bread. It was brewed from fermented grain, often sweetened with wild herbs or honey, a perfect source of calories for the cold months and a welcome substitute for clean drinking water, which was often difficult to obtain in frosty winters. Meat was not a given. In summer, animals could graze on pastures, but in winter, feed had to come from stores, and that was precious. Therefore, surplus animals were often slaughtered in the fall to save feed. The meat was smoked, cured, or dried so that it would keep for months. Ham, dried meat, and dried fish were particularly popular because they kept for a long time and provided a lot of energy. Hunting played a role, but it was difficult in winter. Wild animals became sluggish, their tracks disappeared under the snow, and the days were short. Chasing a deer with a bow and arrow through knee-deep snow was a challenge that was only worthwhile when supplies were running low. That's why meat was often a luxury in winter, or a sign that the hunt had been successful. But meat wasn't the only source of protein. Those who were wise relied on dairy products. Cows, goats, and sheep provided milk, which was used to make butter, cheese, and sour milk. Hard cheese was important because it could be stored for months. Milk was often stored in holes in the ground or cool storage rooms where it stayed fresh. Those who had enough cows could supply themselves with milk even in the depths of winter, a luxury that could mean the difference between life and death in bad years. But dairy products and grains alone were not enough. Peas, beans, and lentils were worth their weight in gold. They were rich in protein, filling, and had a long shelf life. Hazelnuts and walnuts were collected and stored because they provided valuable energy. In bad times, they were even ground into flour. Fresh fruit was rare in winter, except for stored apples and dried berries. Carrots, beets, and parsnips kept well in cool earth cellars. Vegetables were not the main food, but they were an important supplement to prevent deficiency diseases. Without freezers or cans, people had to get creative. Their methods were surprisingly effective. Meat was dried over an open fire so it could be stored for months. Curing with salt kept it from spoiling. Fruit, grains, and herbs were preserved in the sun or in drying rooms. Milk was made into cheese or sour milk to keep it from going bad, and supplies were buried in cool, frost-free earth cellars to keep them fresh. But even the best supplies couldn't stop harsh winters from causing famines. Bad harvests, long cold spells, or early winters were especially dangerous. Those who had not gathered enough in the fall were faced with empty storerooms in January. In desperate times, even tree bark was cooked to fill the stomach. In extreme cases, cannibalism occurred. When tribes were threatened with starvation, the dead were not buried but eaten. Winter was harsh, but standing still meant death. Those who did not move, who simply wanted to sit out the long months, became weak, both physically and mentally. The Germanic tribes knew this, so they found ways not only to move around despite the snow, cold, and darkness, but also to stay fit and make good use of their time. Traveling in winter was a challenge. The roads were icy, the swamps frozen, and deep snow made it almost impossible to get around. But the Germanic tribes were inventive. They used snowshoes made of wood and animal skins to prevent them from sinking into the snow. In the northern regions, they even used primitive sleds to move around more quickly. Horses were equipped with special horseshoes that prevented them from slipping on frozen ground. And when there was no other option, carts were simply replaced by sleds pulled by horses. Wars were rarely fought in winter, but they were not impossible. Frozen rivers, which were insurmountable obstacles in summer, could suddenly be crossed. Fog and snowstorms provided ideal conditions for raids. Surprise attacks, but most battles took place in spring and summer. After all, those who had no food in winter did not have to worry about battles. But even without war, there was plenty to do. Firewood had to be chopped to keep the fires burning. Weapons, tools, and shields were repaired, clothes were sewn, and hides were tanned. Particularly talented craftsmen used the dark months to make jewelry, belts, and ornately decorated everyday objects. Winter was a time of preparation for what came next, but as hard as the months were, they were not all work. The long nights were often spent together around the fire, telling stories and singing songs. The elders passed on their knowledge about nature, hunting, medicinal herbs, and warfare. Dice and board games were popular pastimes, especially tabletop games that later became known as the precursors to chess. Music was an important part of tribal life. Drums, bone flutes, and simple harps kept spirits high. And of course, there were athletic challenges. Wrestling in the snow was a popular way to test strength and endurance. Snowball fights were not only fun, but also served as training for future warriors. People skated on frozen rivers with bone skates, and young men practiced spear throwing and archery. Winter was not only cold, but also dangerous, not because of wild animals or enemy tribes, but because of something much more invisible: disease. In the cramped, smoke-filled longhouses where humans and animals lived together, infections spread rapidly. A simple cough could turn into pneumonia, a small wound could become infected and prove fatal. Medicine as we know it did not exist, but the Germanic tribes had other remedies, and they had to work, because those who fell ill often had only one chance. Either the body fought its way through or it lost. Hygiene was a problem. Running water was often frozen in winter, so bathing remained a rarity. Instead, the Germanic tribes relied on smoke and herbs. They burned thyme and ribwort plantain to purify the air and drank the brew to treat coughs. Chamomile and sage helped against inflammation. Garlic and onions were considered natural antibiotics. Those who had a fever chewed on willow bark. What the Germanic tribes did not know was that it contained salicylic acid, the active ingredient from which aspirin was later developed. But the biggest problem was the cold. Frostbite could be just as deadly as disease. To protect themselves, the Germanic tribes rubbed animal fat on their skin, an early form of cold cream. Fat kept the skin supple and protected it from the icy wind. Despite all these tricks, death was ever present. Those who fell seriously ill often had little chance of survival. But instead of despairing, many Germanic peoples saw illness as a matter of fate. It was believed that the gods determined who would survive and who would not. Priests and seers performed rituals to drive away evil spirits, and sometimes seriously ill people were left to fend for themselves, not out of cruelty, but out of the harsh pragmatism of the time. Winter was not only a physical ordeal, it was also a time of gods and spirits. In the darkness, when the wind howled around the longhouse and the fire flickered, the world was no longer the same. The Germanic peoples believed that during these months, the boundaries between this world and the next became thinner, that their ancestors spoke to them, that spirits roamed the forests, and that the gods tested who was strong enough to see the light of spring again. Particularly important was the Yule festival, a celebration that later became the model for Christmas. It marked the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, the turning point when light returned to dispel the darkness. Huge fires were lit, torches were lit, and sacrifices were made. Some sacrificed food, others brought animals to the sanctuary, a valuable sacrifice intended to ensure protection and fertility for the coming year. Evergreen plants played a special role. In a world where trees lost their leaves and all life was buried under snow, fir and yew trees were symbols of hope. Some tribes hung small offerings in the branches or tied sacred symbols to them, a tradition that later found its way into the Christmas tree. But as much as people celebrated the light, darkness remained a threat. Particularly feared was the Wild Hunt, a ghostly horde led by Woden himself, which raced across the sky on the darkest nights. An angry storm, a horde of restless souls sweeping across the earth and carrying away those who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Those who saw the Wild Hunt were threatened with great misfortune or even death. So people locked their doors and windows, carved protective symbols into the wood, and did not dare to go outside. Winter was also a time of prophecy. When the snow fell outside and the fire crackled inside, the Germanic peoples tried to read the future. Runes were cast, dreams interpreted, signs sought in the ice and smoke. Particularly significant were the Rauhnächte, the days between the winter solstice and New Year's Day, a time full of magic and superstition when the future could be revealed. But winter was more than just a time of fear and rituals. It was a test. Those who survived the cold had not only endured physically, they had also strengthened their souls. Warriors saw the dark months as a kind of inner battle. The fire that burned at night was more than just warmth. It was a symbol of the human spirit, those who could keep their fire burning, those who protected it and carried it through the dark night. They were ready for whatever might come. Today we have central heating, warm clothing and supermarkets, but nature remains unpredictable. Imagine having to survive a winter like the Germanic tribes did. Would you have what it takes? Write your thoughts in the comments. Would you rather hunt, gather supplies, or rely on the gods? If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more exciting stories from the past. And if you want to know how other ancient cultures survived the winter, check out this video here. Stay warm and see you next time.